Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to have back on the podcast Katja Hoyer. Katja is a historian and journalist. She's also a research fellow at King's College London and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. She is also a global opinions contributing columnist for the Washington Post, with her main research areas being in the history of modern Germany. She is the author of Blood and Iron, The Rise and Fall of the German Empire, 1871 to 1918. And she is the author of the latest international bestseller, Beyond the Wall, The History of East Germany. And that is the book we talk about in this conversation. We start the conversation by talking about what is the culture of East and West Germany and how East Germany came to be. We talk about East Germany and its relationship with the Soviet Union. We talk about the political makeup of East Germany in the beginning. We talk about a type of building socialism in the 50s. We talk about creation of the Berlin Wall and the reception of the wall, the Stasi of East Germany, failed economics in East Germany in the 1980s, similarities between unification in 1871 and reunification in 1990. We talk a little bit about Angela Merkel and the post-wall era of Germany and what are the ripple effects in modern-day Germany. And finally, how does a unified Germany move forward? As I said, I've had Katja on before for folks that are curious to listen to that episode. That's number 185. The title is Blood and Iron, A History of the German Empire, where we talk about her first book, Blood and Iron. This conversation, for me, was just as good, if not even better. She's such a wonderful person. I absolutely love her spirit. I love her knowledge. I love the way in which she writes and how she's able to talk about Germany in many, many matters. I loved Beyond the Wall. I thought it was a fantastic book. It deserves all the acclaim that it has received. So folks should go out there and pick up the book and support her as much as they can. As always, you can subscribe to my Substack at Convergent Dialogues at substack.com. So get over there, follow, subscribe. You can also find me on YouTube, same thing. Make sure you spread widely and share the podcast with people that you think would be interested in it. And now I bring you Katja Hoyer. I am here with Katja Hoyer. Katja, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking to you again.
Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. For listeners, I talked to Katja on, I guess it was about almost a year ago. We talked about your first book. For listeners, they can check out the episode. It's 185. The title is called Blood and Iron, A History of the German Empire, often taken from the speech, Blood and Iron. And I think at the time when we were talking, you were working on another book or close to finishing it, which is what we're going to talk about today. The book is entitled Beyond the Wall, A History of East Germany. It's fabulous. It's a fabulous kind of sequel, I guess. So I guess what was it that you wanted to say, I guess, with this book? I don't want to compare it to the previous book, but obviously both are about German history. What were you trying to say with the new one? Obviously it's different time periods, but that you didn't say maybe with the first book, or what was your main aim with this one?
Well, I've had an interest in East Germany for quite a long time. So the idea really was to explore a part of German history that I think hasn't really been explored in as much depth yet, certainly not in English, in the way that I think it deserves, because it's such a comprehensive subject. And there are really two reasons why I think it was particularly spoke to me. One's rather personal. I was actually born in East Germany in the German Democratic Republic, as it was called, just about still in 1985. And it's a strange kind of situation. You were kind of born in a country that isn't on the map today, and it kind of, but I was only 4 years old when the Berlin Wall fell, 5 years old when the country disappeared. So it's not something that I've got very strong memories or experiences of, and therefore there's always been this curiosity really about what the state was like that I could have potentially lived in, basically, if I'd been born, say, 20 years earlier. And on the other side, there's my sort of professional interest as a historian that has kind of led me to an opinion towards East Germany that it's basically underrepresented. When you think how much has been written about the Nazis, about the Weimar Republic, about the First World War, the Second World War, and yet East Germany as a kind of time period, as an era, is longer than all of those things combined, and a lot less has actually been written about it. It always seems to be like this other Germany, the weird one, the anomaly, the footnote, if you will, to the proper Germany, which is West Germany. And so what I was also trying to do from a professional point of view as a historian of Germany was to try and kind of give this chapter of the national history a proper place in the narrative, rather than relegating it to and there was also East Germany kind of thing, that I think has happened before.
Yeah, well, obviously you do a fantastic job of that in the book. I guess the one question, I'm sure we'll touch on this maybe throughout the conversation a bit, but how do we, I guess, understand culturally? I guess when people think of Germany, I think most of the time they think of Germany as it currently is, or right, maybe the Weimar Republic. But was there a major difference when it was East and West Germany? I mean, these are the same people, no? This is the same history, same culture for up until that point. I guess, throughout the time when East Germany is in existence, how does it kind of have this unifying kind of relationship with Germany as it is? Is it like German first and then East-West German? Or how was it, I guess, in terms of a culture and a kind of, in terms of tradition? Was it connected, or was it very distinct in the period that East Germany was there?
Well, it couldn't really, the existence of two German states couldn't really eradicate the feeling of just being German, because that's much older, it's got much longer and deeper historical roots. So just maybe briefly, East Germany came about really because of the Second World War. The fact that Germany had obviously lost the Second World War and was then divided into four zones of occupation, because it had basically completely morally and politically bankrupted itself when Nazism collapsed. The victorious powers decided that they would have to run Germany on behalf of the Germans, because they couldn't be trusted to do that. And as a result of that, they decided to split Germany into four zones, one each kind of being occupied and run by a different power. And one of these fell to Soviet Russia. And as a result of that, you ended up basically with different political systems evolving, one capitalist, so the three Western zones that fell to France, the US and Britain separately, and then the Eastern zone that fell to Soviet Russia, developing in a different way. And that then eventually crystallized into two German states, East and West, in 1949, when they were both founded. And that's not something that the German people got any say over, or that is kind of a natural evolution, over kind of decades or centuries even, of kind of a national consciousness in a way. So it didn't really matter, certainly not initially, whether you lived in, say, Dresden in the East or in Cologne in the West, in terms of the way that you still felt German. Having said all of that, over time, I mean, the state East Germany was in existence for over 4 decades, for over 40 years. And over that time, people were born in that state, and had East German passports. There were separate sports teams, for example, East and West, and there was certainly a form of identity that began to develop. And also people underwent completely different experiences. I'm sure we'll talk about the society and things like that in a little while. But the idea is that they kind of lived separate lives almost. So imagine, like, I don't know, a couple breaking up for an extended period of time and then getting back together, and they come back together as different people because they've effectively gone through different experiences in between, done different things, and then you get back together and expect it to be as before, and more often than not it doesn't turn out that way. So that, I think, is probably the closest analogy I can come up with. So Germans are Germans, but the fact that they've kind of gone through forcibly, not by choice, gone through these different experiences, does mean that eventually a separate identity developed.
It's very interesting how, I'm sure we'll talk about it in terms of society and culture, and again that kind of another unification period of sorts. And so it's very very interesting. So in the first part of the book, or a couple of chapters, you talk about this history of East Germany with kind of a communist state in the Soviet Union, which is really interesting. I didn't know a whole lot about that. I guess generally, you're talking about these four kind of quadrants or zones that Germany was split up into after World War II, and I guess what was the motivation behind that, of course, and then really though, how is this relationship with Stalin's communist Russia and this compromise, and then you can kind of lead into Walter Ulbricht, who was pretty important for East Germany after the war and that relationship with the Soviet Union.
So initially, nobody wanted to split up Germany. There was talk of that during the war, because it was felt that this is the second, major war that had now emanated from German soil, and Germany needed to be made harmless, so it couldn't attack again. And so there were various proposals on the table, but eventually all the allies came to the conclusion that it shouldn't be split up. So the split into four zones wasn't supposed to be a permanent thing. It was just that it's a large country with millions of people in it, and it had to be run by somebody that wasn't German, because when you think about the pervasive nature really of Nazism, the way that it really kind of leaked into all areas of society, nobody could be trusted. You look at somebody who was a judge, say, in the Nazi era, can you really trust them to be a judge again? Same with, say, the police or with government on all levels. So unlike the First World War, after the Second World War, it was decided that somebody else had to run Germany for a while, at least, until Germany could be democratized and denazified. But none of the powers, having just fought a major war, could have run Germany entirely by themselves. It was just too big a task. And so the idea was that they'd each kind of run a part of Germany as a military sort of government, if you will, but make decisions in unison. And there was something called the Allied Control Council, ACC, which was supposed to be a central kind of government where all four powers agreed on stuff. So say, for example, if they wanted to introduce a new currency, all four of them should, in theory, come together and say, right, we're going to roll out a new currency in Germany. And then the way that this is done happens in each of the four zones. The problem is, of course, that when you have two entirely opposing systems, so you got, the idea of sort of socialism / communism in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and then in the West, of course, the sort of capitalist democratic system. Each power very quickly started to imprint its own sort of ideal on its zones, and therefore, over the course of sort of the next 4 years, from 1945 to 49, the two sides of Germany drifted apart until it was basically there was no going back anymore, and it solidified into two different states. But this wasn't something that the Soviets in particular were keen on, in my opinion, despite the fact that this is often portrayed otherwise. I think Stalin had really sort of drawn the short straw there when it came to his zone of occupation. He'd basically received the northeast, which is quite flat, sandy soil, not particularly good for anything really other than very specialized forms of agriculture. All of the industry was in the west, in the Ruhr region, which was occupied by Britain. So basically, he couldn't draw as many kind of reparations and resources as punishment for the Second World War and to rebuild his own country out of the east of Germany as he could have done if the whole of Germany was still kind of together. The thing is, though, because he has his own zone rebuilt by German communists, so he sends a group of communists back into Germany that had spent the war in exile. They'd kind of fled Nazi Germany because they were obviously under mortal danger there, and spent the war in Moscow. And these people now get sent back into the east of Germany to rebuild things. And to them, this is the first and only chance to build socialism in Germany. They're all convinced communists, and they think for the first time now, here's a chance to have an actual socialist state on German soil, for which you don't need a revolution, because that hadn't happened at various points before. And they'd kind of already given up on the idea, more or less, some of them. And now they get the chance for the first time. So they kind of work against Stalin in many ways, in that they basically want their own separate German state that they can use to build socialism. And that's how, to some extent, this kind of situation became more and more a fact, really, even though a lot of other people did not want to split Germany into two bits.
How was it that there became this hierarchical makeup of the German Democratic Republic in East Germany? And how did they kind of form their own constitution? First elections in 1950. How did these things come about if it's a new country that's being basically established?
Well, initially, because Stalin wasn't keen on splitting things up, and I mean, East Germany was only founded nearly half a year after West Germany was as a state. Shows you again how reluctant they were. They're still really keen. Both sides, actually, East and West Germany, are very keen not to look like the splitters. You know, both sides basically want to blame the other for the division of Germany, and so they both create a constitution that almost looks, on paper at least, like the other, so that they can be merged together again if necessary. They both declare their constitutions temporary until German unity can be restored. And on paper, they both look very similar. So East Germany, actually, despite its sort of dictatorial makeup, has got a multi-party system on paper. So there are various different political parties, and some of them are actually the same as in the West. So again, with the idea that, you know, you can merge them back together the moment the opportunity arises. So initially, Walter Ulbrecht, who is sort of the leader of these East German communists, of the German communists that get sent back from Moscow, decides that at least he needs to make it sort of look democratic, both to please the West and ironically also to please Stalin, to say to him, well, look, I'm trying, you know, we have to have this separate state for now, but I'm really keeping it in a way that allows us to merge them back together later if need be. And that's also how these kind of faux elections come about. So they aren't like real elections in the sense that you get an actual choice. Basically, you go into the voting booth, and there's a list in front of you that has got all of the names of the different candidates on it from all the different political parties. But it's a fixed list. So really all that you do is you can't choose the individual candidates or the individual parties. You just agree to the list. So you fold that piece of paper as you get it, and you just put it right back into the urn and walk back out. And people called it paper folding, basically, because it was such a farcical procedure, you know, rather than actual real elections, because all of the numbers of the individual candidates were already set. And of course, the socialist ruling party, the SED, always had the largest number of seats. And the other parties only got allocated kind of lesser numbers. So all of that is there to make it look on paper as though the two Germanys can be unified kind of at any moment in time.
Yeah, it's interesting how there's this relationship with the Soviet Union was very important. After Stalin dies, how does East Germany, they have some kind of chaos and, you know, there's some uprisings, and how does Ulrich move away from Stalin and kind of do this building of socialism of sorts?
So Ulbricht already started that even while Stalin was still alive, which was quite interesting. He actually gets summoned to Moscow several times, Ulbricht, you know, like a sort of naughty schoolboy that has to go back to the headmaster, and he gets told to not overdo it, which is somewhat ironic. I mean, if Stalin tells you to just calm down and, you know, sort of chill, then, you know, you're basically taking it to a whole new level of building up communism. Because it was all too quick, basically. All that Stalin wanted out of East Germany is reparations. And Ulbricht was pressing ahead with this building up of socialism so quickly that he was basically wrecking the economy. And this is something that, of course, Stalin didn't want. But then once Stalin dies in 1953, there's a brief moment where sort of people in East Germany who initially actually, a lot of them, thought that this could genuinely be a new Germany, something better than all of the militarism, the chaos, and the wars that they'd seen before. There's a brief moment when Stalin dies when people think actually maybe now there is this moment we can build up a genuinely kind of better society. And that's very quickly crushed when they find out that basically you have no means of initiating any kind of reform. Really, there's no, the press isn't free. There's censorship. The different political parties do exist, but they're very much under the cosh of the Socialist Party. And so when all of this comes together alongside kind of very severe economic problems that the country has, and people work very, very hard and get very little out of it, at the end of the day, shelves are still empty, their currency isn't worth much. And the country is still straggling, even after 4 years of trying to build it up. At that point, everything comes to a sort of collision, and you get a mass uprising in 1953 in the summer, on the 17th of June, which the Soviets have to come in and crush. And once that's happened, it makes it very obvious to Walter Ulbrecht that he can't really stay in the saddle by trying to ignore his people and the Soviets, because ultimately, he has no protection basically if that happens. And so he follows kind of a twin course really of trying to appease the Soviets and doing what they say, even though Stalin is dead at that point, and trying to appease his own people as well by loosening some of the restrictions, allowing a degree of capitalism back into the economy, and sort of just genuinely or generally, liberalizing things in all sorts of ways. And that is quite interesting. You see this back and forth basically throughout the whole time of the East German history, basically, that you get this kind of opening up and appeasement of the people, and then the moment people feel, or the regime feels, it's back in the saddle, it sort of closes back in on itself at other times. And the same goes for its relationship with the Soviet Union, which kind of swings back and forth between a defiance or a sense that East Germany wants to do its own thing, and then on the other hand realizing that it can't, because it's entirely dependent on goodwill in Moscow.
So, as all of this is happening, how does the idea of building a wall in Berlin, which we now know as the Berlin Wall, how did that come about? And I mean, we can look back on this now as it's terrible, but I guess what was the rationale and the motivations at the time for building a wall in Berlin, and how is it received by people in East Germany and folks in West Germany as this wall through Berlin? Just kind of give the context and the rationale for doing that at the time.
So I think people often forget that, we imagine the Berlin Wall to be a barrier really between the whole of the communist world and the whole of the Western world, when actually what made West Germany very attractive to East Germans is that you can move back and forth within the same country. So if you're East German and you think, actually, I have better chances to make something of myself, to earn a decent income, to get a better living standard in West Germany, it's not like moving to a different country. People speak the same language over there. You immediately become a citizen. You can start working. It's an easier choice to make compared to, say, somebody in Poland or in Czechoslovakia to say they want to move, say, to France, to a completely different country. And that problem that there's kind of another Germany just on the other side is always there right from the beginning, from 1949. So by 1961, when the Berlin Wall is built, around 3 million people had left the country. And the population was reduced to around 16 million or so, or 15, I think, even at that point. From 18 million, and you basically end up with a complete brain drain. It's mostly people like middle class people, skilled workers, engineers, people who will basically get a better life in West Germany. When you think about the idea that socialism is supposed to create a classless society, so basically everybody earns the same, everybody's got the same living standards, there's no absolute poverty, but in exchange, there's also no luxury. And so anybody above the average, so basically middle class people upwards, will lose out in a system like that. And then there's another system just on the other side where they don't lose out, where they do get higher salaries and better living standards than the average. And that's why most of these types of people leave. And that's, of course, a serious problem for the state when your doctors, your lawyers, your architects, your teachers run away, and you basically can't run the country. It stops to function. And initially, that was still completely legal and safe to do. So right at the beginning, you could walk across at any point, really, between East and West Germany. In 1952, the inner German border, so basically the long land border between East and West Germany, is closed off. But Berlin, which is still occupied by all four powers, is still an open city because it's different basically in terms of its status. It doesn't belong in theory to East or West Germany. It's kind of just divided into the four occupational zones still. So if you are in Dresden in East Germany and you want to go to West Germany, all you have to do is travel to East Berlin, which is legal, and then you just walk across into West Berlin. It's also legal because the city is open. And then you take a train out from West Berlin into West Germany, and that was safe, legal, and perfectly feasible. And that's why so many people left. So Walter Ulbrecht, as I said, really worried about the economy and about the imbalance that this brain drain created, has been pestering the Soviets basically for years at that point in 1961, to be able to close off that last remaining border. The Soviets were concerned because it's a very fragile balance. I mean, as I said, the city of Berlin was still occupied, so you had American and British and French troops in there. So any change to the city was potentially going to create a huge problem in the Cold War. You know, this, when you think about this, is 1961. That's 1 year before the Cuban Missile Crisis. It really is the height of Cold War tension. Anyone fires a shot at anybody else, or anybody overreacts, somebody gets arrested or something like that, and it could potentially create a crisis and bloodshed on an altogether different scale. And so the Soviets kind of held back for a long time. But 1961, it had really reached a point where the GDR was falling apart, which in itself would have created a security problem for the Soviets. Because they basically didn't want to obviously give it up without getting anything back for it. And so they eventually consented and allowed Walter Ulbricht to build that wall. And interestingly, when it does get built, it does initially create a lot of misery, in particular also bloodshed to start with, simply because it is a really imperfect kind of physical construction. You know, you mustn't imagine that overnight an actual physical wall is standing in the middle of Berlin. This was a city that wasn't meant to be divided. So, you know, people used buildings, for example, as part of the wall, which meant that they had to break up the windows. Whole streets, canals, rivers, you know, all had to somehow be closed off. And to start with, all that stood between you and the other side was soldiers, people. And so basically they had to, they were told to shoot at people if you walked across or tried to get across, because there was no physical boundary to start with that could have stopped anybody. And that's why you get so many of the overall casualties really happening in the first few years before the wall is kind of perfected and holds most people back just in its physical presence. And so that is, of course, creating a lot of genuine misery and bloodshed to start with. However, I also spoke to a lot of people who lived quite far away from that and had no interest in leaving, really, mostly sort of working class people in the smaller cities away from Berlin, who said that it didn't really concern them because they had no intention to leave. And they actually said for the first time the situation was beginning to stabilize. It felt like the economy had a chance to recover. One woman said to me the doctor had intended to go, their village GP had intended to leave and now couldn't, so he had to stay. And everybody in the village was relieved that they still had a doctor there, basically. So those kinds of things, those stories also exist, and it's that complexity I was really trying to get across in the book.
It is interesting because it seems as if Berlin at the time was a type of crossroads, right? But I guess the other question I have there, though, is, I mean, it's still it's still a wall. I mean, it's a literal physical barrier. I mean, walls keep people. I mean, you can in one sense see walls as being aggressive of sorts of it's keeping people out or trying to keep people in. But I mean, was it received in those kinds of ways? I guess for people living in Berlin, maybe people outside of Berlin, maybe less so. But I guess was it seen as a kind of negative, aggressive thing, or was it just kind of like, yeah, that's what we have to do. We have to just make sure that we can keep our economy okay, or I don't know. I guess like the optics of a wall right in the middle of the city. I mean, how was that received, or was it just really mixed? Because there had to have been enough people that were going to go along with it, right? There wasn't just going to be like, yeah, sure, do it. I mean, some people didn't revolt necessarily against it, right? So I guess what was the like tenor of people, accepting or not accepting actual physical structure in Berlin?
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting that you get actually very little resistance against it. So there's certainly not the sort of uprising of the scale that happened in 1953, as we discussed earlier, or that you see again in 1989, where there's virtually like millions out on the streets. That doesn't happen. There is unrest in Berlin, but it's actually more on the western side than on the eastern side, so in West Berlin. Um, People are very outraged about this whole thing, and obviously feel free to also sort of announce that outrage out on the streets. But I think a lot of people felt that something had to happen. I mean, it is really odd now in hindsight to say that, because obviously the Berlin Wall is an entirely cruel structure that tore people and families and friends apart from one another, especially in Berlin. And that is one side. So you speak to those people, and they were absolutely furious, and many of those that are still around still are absolutely furious about it. But on the flip side, you also have a lot of people who, sort of felt that the economy of the state they were plowing a lot of work and effort and belief into and hope into was crumbling underneath them. It was kind of like you were working incredibly hard, and everything that you were trying to build up was poured into a system that trained people. Many people did their university education, for example, in the East, or their degrees or their apprenticeships, and then actually went with those qualifications into the West. And that was also something that aggravated a lot of other people. So it completely depended on whether you were sort of happy where you were, and lots of people were very rooted, for example, in their local communities. They just didn't want to leave. They'd been at home in a particular region for centuries and saw no reason to leave, and wanted that to stabilize. So it is really interesting that actually when you speak to most people that were around at the time, they perceive the 1960s as a period of relative stability. It needs to be seen in context as well. When you think people had previously had the post-war years where everything was unstable, then they obviously had the Second World War, Nazism. Before that, you had the Great Depression following from the Wall Street crash. You had the Weimar Republic that didn't really work yet, the First World War. It's a long, long time before anybody in East Germany had known any kind of stability. And the 1960s felt like, for the first time, you had your job, you had somewhere to live, childcare and all those things were being built up. The cities were beginning to be cleared of the rubble of the bombings, and new buildings were being erected. So, there was also kind of this offset that the government tried to put into place, namely, we've locked people in, now we need to make it worthwhile for them to stay.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it's very fascinating when you're talking about the stability and economic stability, especially the context you give there. So tell us about this, the Stasi Empire, right? And kind of keeping folks in East Germany as opposed to keeping others out. To talk about that and how that came about and why that was felt to be necessary.
Well, the Stasi, which is arguably the most famous or rather infamous aspect really of East Germany, was a part of that system right from the beginning. It was actually set up in 1950 as the sword and shield of the party, was kind of the motto of this organization, like the protection basically of the political elite. And I think it came out of a kind of deep-seated sense of paranoia that the elites of the state could never shake off and would never shake off. There was always a sense that they didn't trust their own people. They didn't believe that people would kind of genuinely try and work with the system and build it up. Even where they did, and when they did, there was still always an underlying sense of we need to watch them, otherwise something is going to happen. And I think that's partially due to the individuals that you've got there, because if you're a communist in 1949, you haven't suddenly come out of nowhere. You've been a communist for a long time, and you were willing to die for it, potentially, because it was incredibly dangerous to be a German communist during the war years and before, under Nazism, and also in the Weimar Republic. So these people were kind of in a habit, because they'd done it their whole lives, of looking over their shoulder, not trusting even the people around them, because they were all denouncing each other when they lived in Stalin's Russia as well. And Stalin was beginning to target German communists because he suspected them of being spies for Hitler. So they'd been in that mode of paranoia, looking around them, looking under their beds, literally, in some cases, all the time. And that's something that becomes kind of state policy, because everybody in the government is like that. And then the Stasi becomes kind of like an instrument for the government to feel safe, to have somebody there that watches them. But it very quickly also turns onto the very people it seeks to protect. So the government ministers themselves also get spied upon by the Stasi. So, for example, because they fear the public after the 1953 uprising, there's genuine kind of fear there that they might be targeted by a kind of popular revolution. They all move out of Berlin into a little settlement in the middle of the forest north of Berlin. And that settlement is run by the Stasi, which is quite a kind of claustrophobic situation for a lot of them to be in. So it's a fenced off, kind of like a gated community, if you will, where they all live. It's got its own bakery, its own butchers, its own hairdressers, but everybody in that settlement works for the Stasi. So imagine you're the wife of a minister and you go to have your hair cut, and you talk to the hairdresser and you sit there and you complain that there are no oranges at the moment because of shortages in food supplies. Guess where the hairdresser's going to go next to tell, basically the Stasi that you complained about this thing, So basically it becomes an all-knowing thing that becomes so mighty and overpowering that even people in government themselves don't really know how to control it anymore. And that's kind of how it takes on its own life. Just to give you one more example, Erich Mielke, who runs the Stasi for most of the time, actually starts collating information even on the second leader of East Germany, Erich Honecker, who runs East Germany for the second half of its existence, in a little red suitcase. You couldn't make this up. I mean, it's just like pure spy novel material. And in this red suitcase, he keeps things like, for example, funds that Honecker is supposed to have embezzled to buy a sort of little country bungalow for his mistress. Also, when Honecker was arrested during his early years under the Nazi regime, he was arrested, and his father pleaded on his behalf, to ensure basically that he wasn't being killed. And his father sent a letter to the Nazi authorities to say that his son, Erich Honecker, has now seen the error of his ways and is now convinced that fascism is the right way forward, which he obviously only said to get Honecker out of danger. But these papers were also kept in that little red suitcase. So here's somebody who's supposed to protect the government and the head of government collecting information on those very people just in case he needed incriminating material one day. And that's kind of how the Stasi spirals out of control and becomes this kind of huge monster of an organization that controls and watches and monitors pretty much every aspect of life in the GDR.
Yes, it does feel kind of like a spy novel. It's wild that's for folks that was a reality, like that this is the conditions they were living under. And it's interesting how in the book and when you tell this story, it just seems that there's maybe some good aspects to some of the things we're trying to do economically, but this period, particularly in East Germany, just feels like this aspect of trial and error, right? Like after World War II, obviously, the Nazi regime, as terrible as it was, how you rebuild, how you have this kind of reconstruction, if you will, was a lot of trial and error, and you have different figures, you have different things going on, and some things work, some things get out of control, some things don't, and it's just very interesting to see how that evolves, especially understanding where the world was in terms of the Cold War at the time and where things were economically. It's just very fascinating to see kind of East Germany in particular's role there. And so when we get to the 80s, how was East Germany trying to focus their economics on coal and microelectronics and other elements, but it wasn't quite enough for their economic system, and how that view of their economic stability started to change. I think in our last conversation we had talked about kind of early on, turn of the century maybe, that there was this kind of pride that Germany took in making certain types of materials and really kind of having the German kind of model in terms of many different types of materials. And so I wonder, kind of in this period during the 80s, how they were trying to do certain things, but it just wasn't enough, at least in East Germany. I don't know about West Germany, but in East Germany, to sustain their economic system. And so what was the kind of story there?
Well, the fundamental underlying problem is that the German model that has worked fairly successfully, basically all the way from 1871 to now, consists of buying cheap stuff from poor countries. So at the moment, that's well, not poor countries, but countries that have raw materials available cheaply. So at the moment, for instance, that's China and was Russia. And then you make things with those raw materials that are highly specialized, require a lot of skill, and end up basically being high quality products that people are willing to pay a lot of money for, and then you export those things again. And that's how Germany makes money, and how it's basically been able to ride out a lot of economic storms as well. The problem is that East Germany couldn't do that because it wasn't part of a trade network that allowed it to import and export freely. So it's obviously part of the socialist bloc. Initially, West Germany actually put something like a trade embargo in place. It was called the Hallstein Doctrine. Basically, West Germany said that it's the only Germany, the only legitimate Germany. In actual fact, it took a long time for it to even come close to accepting that East Germany is a country. It was just called the zone, i.e. the zone of occupation. And so West Germany felt free to say to the rest of the world, well, look, if you want to trade with us, and we are the bigger, more prosperous, more powerful country with the industry, then you're not trading with East Germany. And that's a kind of principle that most countries adhere to, because you wouldn't snub the powerful West German economy just so you could do some trade with East Germany. That just didn't happen. And so it was pretty isolated, and it had to look to other socialist countries to try and trade with. The problem is that the Soviet Union, as kind of the biggest of those countries, was itself struggling through a lot of the time periods that we're talking about there. And it wasn't really able to fulfill really either role, kind of providing raw materials or buying expensive stuff from Germany. Neither of those things worked, at least not to the same degree. So that becomes, for instance, quite obvious when initially the Soviet Union promises, as we see with Germany still today as an issue, promises to deliver oil and gas to East Germany to try and kind of wean it off the brown coal that it's still using for most of its energy needs at that point. And it does that for a while, and East Germany actually helps build up those pipelines that still deliver the stuff to Germany today. And then at some point after the oil crises of the 70s hit in, the Soviet Union decides actually it's probably much better off selling that oil on the world market rather than supplying East Germany as their contracts had actually prescribed. And so it just delivers less oil and gas to East Germany than it had previously promised, which then means that, where's East Germany going to get that stuff from? And this is just one example really of why the system doesn't quite work and why the economy is struggling. They then try and find fields where they can basically do this German model without kind of running into these problems that I just mentioned. And one of those fields is microelectronics. So they try and get into this whole field of sort of computer chip technology and all of that kind of stuff that's beginning to develop in the 1980s. Actually working very closely with Japan, interestingly enough. Not many people know that. Honecker actually traveled over to Japan and talked to companies like Toshiba, Sony, and so on about production methods, about automizing certain processes and things like that. But this is basically a pipe dream because it never really comes about. The regime is far too old at that point. Honecker is really struggling to get his head around all of these things. For a long time, they didn't take it seriously. Walter Ulbrecht had actually started arguing for computer technology in the 1960s, and he was laughed at. It was kind of like it was seen as the project of an aging leader who wanted some sort of legacy for himself, and people just didn't take it seriously enough. So none of that really comes about. East Germany does do quite well in certain areas. So, for example, it specializes in sort of high quality toys. Sounds an odd thing, but they did. They made sort of dolls and teddy bears and all sorts of things that got exported to the West as well, including the US and Britain and other Western countries. Also things like furniture. So they made like shelving systems and all sorts of stuff that was then sold in Western mail order like catalogs and stuff. So some of these things kind of brought in some revenue, but this whole kind of economic loop that I described earlier just doesn't work if you haven't got access to the world market, basically, and that was East Germany's problem, and that never went away, and it became a huge problem in the 80s. Once the oil crises had sort of hit in and caused huge problems, as we know, in the Western world as well, but the GDR didn't have the sort of economic resources really to fall back on other models.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting. So tell us about the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989, and then reunification a year later in October of 1990. And I guess just a comparison point again, how was the unification in 1871 similar or dissimilar to the reunification, many years later in 1990? To try and have this kind of unity as a people and country despite all of the wars and economic conflicts.
Well, it's something that in hindsight, I think the fall of the Berlin Wall seems more, I think, than a lot of other events in the 20th century, as if it was like an inevitability. We see it now as something that just had to happen. People in Germany feel the same way. It's because this division of a country seems unnatural. Many people would argue that the whole kind of concept of socialism or communism was never going to work, and so eventually it was going to fall apart. There are all sorts of reasons now, looking back, where people think actually this was always going to happen at some point. But it's interesting that when you actually look at what people say and do right up to unification, to the fall of the Berlin Wall in the autumn of 1989, is that people didn't see it coming. Nobody did. Even if you look at stuff like, Ronald Reagan's famous speech where he asked Gorbachev to tear down this wall, that was 2 years before it actually happened, and it was just one of many Cold War speeches, where, calling the Soviet Empire the evil empire and all of that kind of stuff. It was one of those speeches, and it wasn't taken any more or less seriously at the time than the others, and became kind of iconic in hindsight. So this wasn't an obvious thing to happen. And even when the Berlin Wall falls in the autumn of 1989, there are still many people who'd actually been leaders of the mass demonstrations that happened that led up to this moment, who still say actually they want to reform the system within the GDR, within East Germany, rather than bring about unification. Many people actually feared what would happen if you immediately unify Germany, what would happen to all the things that the East had kind of built up. And so they were still arguing for reform rather than reunification. That only changed later. But once the wall is open, basically you have exactly the same situation as before. People are going to leave. And that becomes an obvious issue right from the beginning. The Soviet Union is also crumbling at the same time. Massive changes in Eastern Europe. You have the Solidarity movement for more democracy and change in Poland, for example. lots of movements all across Eastern Europe. Hungary had opened its border with Austria. So really change was afoot in East Germany, and East Germans were kind of part of that, but also some people felt that they were kind of swept away in this wave of change that was happening. And so very quickly, the different options are on the table. Do you kind of reunify Germany quickly, or do you do it over a longer period of time? And the first free elections that happened in the spring of 1990 for East Germans show that most people wanted a quick unification process, kind of an immediate unification at that point. So things happened so quickly, basically, that between the autumn of 1989 and the spring of 1990, it's completely changed. Kind of the tone of discussion has completely changed. And then by, as you say, by October 1990, things are kind of all wrapped up. Really, just a year after the Berlin Wall fell, and the two Germanys unify on the 3rd of October. Literally overnight, kind of East Germany just ceases to exist, which is interesting. And I think in that respect, the reason why I actually compare in the book that unification, that reunification of Germany, to the unification of Germany in 1871, because both were kind of assumed initially to be some sort of like triumph, basically, something that had happened, had been completed. Germany was now one country. But I think in 1871, there was more of an awareness that it would take time to build a society that would follow this. So people very consciously start interlinking infrastructure. For example, in 1871, you get the railway network is expanded. You get various educational reforms, centralization of different things, to try and create one country. Now that they've created a state, to create one nation, there's a very conscious effort there to basically engage in nation building. And I think that's what's lacking in 1990. There was kind of this assumption that the two Germanys would just sort of fall back into each other's arms and everything would be as before. And that doesn't really work, because people forget that 41 years is a long time.
Yeah.
People had been living very different lifestyles. One thing that we didn't really have time to talk about was kind of the role of women, for example, in East Germany. So, the state encouraged women to go and work and study and take part in society in a way that happened much later in the West. And so by 1989, almost all women, over 90%, are in full-time employment, and feel very equal to men, basically. And that hadn't happened in West Germany, which was a very conservative society still. And suddenly it was just expected that kind of women go back home and rejoin family life and be housewives, because childcare was cut back immediately and made it pretty difficult for them to carry on with that lifestyle, kind of having a career and a child at the same time. And those sorts of things, I mean, this is just one example, but in many ways, life had been completely different in the East compared to the West, were ignored this time. And there wasn't really a concerted effort to try and unify the nation rather than just the state structures. Really, East Germany was kind of just assimilated into, or annexed, some people like to phrase it, into West Germany. There wasn't really unification as such. It was more of a takeover, really. And that's, I think, the difference between 1871, where the states kind of all consented to join that union, and then it was given time and effort and money and thought to try and create a society out of that one Germany.
I did like the bit in the book about the kind of comparison between 1871 and 1990. So one of my last two questions here is it's interesting. So it's been 33 years, almost very, very close to exactly 33 years. And we had in for, what was it, 18 of those years, Germany had a pretty influential chancellor in Angela Merkel. I know you've written about her in very unique ways. How do we see many of the things, so you're talking about economic stability, you're talking about some type of stability overall, for folks in the United States and for folks in many parts of the world, Germany, since 2005, really, or whenever Angela Merkel got into office as chancellor, Germany was seen as a very powerful state again, very, very stable, economically secure, etc. And I know she's from East Germany, if I have this right. So just kind of fast forward us to kind of more present day, and this isn't entirely what's in your book, but I just want to see kind of what's the ripple effect of, okay, we have East West Germany for 40 years, then we have reunification, and so what was the outcome of that? How did that happen, and what was the significance of, or if any, of chancellor being in leadership from East Germany for almost 20 years and having that kind of stability? Just kind of, briefly, just kind of to describe some of the nuance there, of the ripple effect and maybe some of her legacy, if you will.
Well, it's interesting that people assumed in 1990 that the two Germanys would just naturally kind of grow back together because they'd always belonged together. And people clearly wanted that to happen as well, the way that they voted. And also the actions of East Germans had shown that they wanted to be part of one country again with West Germany. But I think the problems that I outlined earlier, I think East Germans weren't even aware of that themselves, the differences that they'd kind of experienced during those 40 years, and same in West Germany, meant that basically two slightly different societies have emerged. And you still see that today in the way that people vote, and pretty much any other statistic. I find it really interesting that when surveys get done, and you click kind of on the map of function, so you want the results mapped out on the map of Germany, it almost always highlights the exact same borders once again between East and West, as they would have been before 1989. And I looked at different ones, when I was writing the book, to try and see if my kind of instinct on that was right. And it doesn't really matter whether you look at things like unemployment, for example, you come up with higher figures in the East and the West, so all of these economic factors, but also cultural things. You look at, for instance, whether people drink wine or beer, and you end up with that border. You look at things like life satisfaction, you end up with the border drawn there. And most importantly, for the current circumstances, the way that people vote. You get much more extreme voting in the East, particularly for kind of far right parties, but also far left as well, because people are simply unhappy and they're looking for alternatives for the from the status quo, which isn't working for them. And so that is interesting as a legacy, despite having a kind of chancellor from East Germany there for 16 years. I use Angela Merkel actually as an example quite a lot in the book, because I feel, as the kind of the most prominent, most famous East German, she's a good example for a lot of things. But it's interesting that during the 16-year tenure as chancellor, and also before, when she was a minister and in other prominent political roles, she never really made a big thing out of out of her East German background, because she knew it would be detrimental to her political career. And even right at the end, it's very interesting. In her last major speech in office in 2021, and I start the book with this, she said that she still feels as though, like, she's got a point to prove. She's not a native, as it were, of this Federal Republic of Germany that she led for 16 years. People still, like journalists, still write about her as if she was sort of alien, to the whole system. One publication, which was actually praising her, which was interesting, called her East German background, so the fact that she lived in the GDR for 35 years, ballast, so something like heavy and burdensome that you should shrug off. And she said, well, hang on a minute, this is 35 years of my life. That's where I, grew up, went to school, went to university, started working. It's not ballast, it's my life. But the fact that she only said that right at the end of her political career, rather than during her life during her period as chancellor, I think tells you a lot about how the rest of the millions of East Germans that were born in that country, how many of them feel in East Germany, because that doesn't just apply to the Chancellor, which she said in her speech as well. It applies to a lot of East Germans. You are in any sort of job, particularly when they go to West Germany, people still look down on them. They still say they're not doing things properly, or they need to learn how to do things properly. This voting pattern that I described earlier, which is really kind of the same, I would say, dynamic as the sort of left behind sort of narrative that you also get in the US and in the sort of former, in the Rust Belt and elsewhere. It's the same as that kind of, detachment from what's going on in the political sphere that you see in East Germany as well. And yet even that, people say to East Germans, you were obviously raised in a dictatorship and you don't understand how democracy works, when actually most people in East Germany voted for mainstream parties, the vast majority, in the early 90s. That only begins to shift once it's become clear that the system doesn't work for them and doesn't accept them. And so that legacy, that kind of anger detachment is still very much there, I feel. And it's getting worse, actually, when I go back I live in the UK, but when I go back to see friends and family in what was East Germany, the sort of, it's quite shocking to me every time I go back how much more angry and how much more kind of resigned people are with the political situation.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, kind of how, when you were talking there about the impact and just kind of some of the social cultural stuff, you look at polls and demographics, and it is interesting how that split isn't there actually anymore, or divide, I should say, between East and West Germany, but it kind of comes through maybe in some of those other components, which is really, really interesting. So last question here is, what's the future look like for Germany? How does Germany, I mean, just in 150 years has had so much history. How do they, kind of accept, all chapters of their history, the good and the bad, and listen to all narratives, East and West Germany and all together, and how do they, kind of move forward, in a more unified way, I guess.
I think there just needs to be an acceptance that you don't leave the past behind. I think there's a
Mm.
desire often in Germany to do that. And there's actually a word for it, which Germans use, which is Vergangenheitsbewältigung, kind of overcoming. A lovely German compound word, as so many.
I love
Um,
those. I love that. I can't say them. You do it for me, but they're fantastic though.
Yeah, so Vergangenheitsbewältigung basically means overcoming the past, which I have lots of problems with that whole concept, because it, to me, it triggers this image of Germany on a psychiatrist's sofa, on a couch,
Mm.
talking to somebody about his childhood traumas and how to get past them. Whilst I think, you can't get rid of these things. You have to accept that they're there, that they were done. This division of Germany existed. You can't just forget about it and expect these Germans to forget about it. But it needs to be part of the national story that we tell ourselves, our children, future generations. Because if not, then it's exactly as kind of trying to bury a deep trauma somewhere in the corner of your mind, and trying to get past it, because it will come back to bite you. It's there still. And so what I was trying to do with the book was to make some sort of contribution to that. But it's extremely, or it was extremely interesting to me to see the response to that in Germany, because it completely exploded. I mean, I'd expected some controversy in Germany because of the kind of somewhat detached, neutral tone, I think, that I use in the book, rather than kind of saying everything was bad. I sort of just describe what happened, or the way that I see it happening in East Germany, to readers, and then readers can make their own minds up. And it's very interesting. It's caused a massive debate in Germany. The book's been discussed on all the major media channel. There's a debate named after me, the Hoyer debate, which is a great tick off my bucket list. But it certainly isn't an easy discussion to have. But I just found it incredibly fascinating, sitting in Britain basically and looking on to this with some detachment. Luckily, I'm sort of sitting in exile, if you will. But looking onto this, and seeing just how emotional it all is, that I'd expected some sort of rational academic debate, around whether the way that I talk about East Germany is kind of right and proper. But instead, it ended up being incredibly personal. People attacked me for my own sort of background. I discussed this briefly in the book. My dad was an officer in the Air Force in East Germany, and my mother a teacher. So they were certainly not opposition people. Equally, I still feel, and I felt, this for a long time, they were very apolitical people. They very quickly adapted to the conditions in West Germany. My mum is still a teacher actually today, so has been a teacher in kind of capitalist democratic Germany for much longer than the GDR, and yet people, were sort of saying, oh, obviously it was typical, that she talks about the GDR in this way, but because of her parentage. And, I was 4 years old when the Berlin Wall fell. It was totally absurd to me that somebody would even come up with that. But it was just interesting to me how personal, emotional, and ugly the debate very quickly became around my book. And there was another book that came out kind of shortly before, by an East German author who basically wrote about the period from 1990 to now, and said that there's still a concerted effort to sort of keep East Germans out of positions of power and government, almost like a minority within Germany, where he said people are being discriminated against. And that also is still a bestseller now, even though that came out, I think, in March or in February earlier in the year, because it just created this massive debate between the two books. And that, I think, clearly shows that this is something that Germany hasn't overcome and needs to still talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I felt in reading this book as compared to the previous book you wrote, this one definitely felt more personal, not just because you were born in East Germany, but it just you tell a lot of narrative accounts, which are really, really nice. And it feels more personal. It feels, it's obviously very close. It wasn't that long ago. There's obviously still many people that are alive and from there. So it feels different. And I could totally see that. I could totally see how it could have a kind of emotional, visceral kind of reaction, which, I don't think it's always a bad thing. I don't think you want to be in the hot seat about some of these things.
No,
but
it's certainly got people talking. I mean,
but that's good. Yeah, I think it's good for people to talk. So, well, Katja, I mean, this is obviously, you're so lovely to talk to. You have such a good handle on all of these issues, and it's always a lot of fun talking to you on the podcast here. The book is called Beyond the Wall: History of East Germany. Where's the best places to find yourself, or any place in particular you want to point people to in terms of your writing or anything like that?
So either Twitter, I'm at Hoyer_Kat, and I've also got an online blog, a Substack called Zeitgeist,
nice.
where I write about a lot of German history on a weekly basis. So that's free to subscribe to, and there's 2 sort of little pieces that I write a week about basically all sorts of aspects of history. Some East Germany, but not all of it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Katja, again, thanks so much for coming back on. You're always welcome here. I really enjoy your voice and your brilliance, and so it's always wonderful. So big thanks for coming on again.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be back on and talk to you about East Germany.
Absolutely.